In contrast to what makes a job difficult to learn and play in Final Fantasy XIV, what makes a job easy to learn and play in Final Fantasy XIV? Naturally, it is often a subjective thing, but somehow most can agree that jobs like Monk, Black Mage, Gunbreaker and Astrologian are considered really difficult, while Reaper, Dancer, Warrior and especially Summoner tend to be mentioned as really easy jobs to pick up. Putting into words why some jobs are easy can sometimes make it easier to understand, so I will go over a few common factors that can cause a job to be easy. And I would love to hear in the comments what kind of things make a job seem really easy for you to pick up or even master. Now, before I get started, I just want to point out that generally, easy jobs in the game tend to be considered easy because they have multiple of these common factors present. That is to say that for some of the factors, you might see me list jobs that are not actually considered that easy by most, because they only have one of these factors really pronounced, which usually isn't enough. So, the first factor that can cause a job to be very easy is what I think a lot of us know as the click the shiny button effect. Warrior has this in some capacity, but the absolute king of this factor is Summoner, which spends almost all of their rotation either having a shiny button flashing to be used, or almost straight up only have correct buttons to press. The one thing that can make this a bit confusing is Ruin 4, and of course the flexibility of being able to use the 3 primals in any order you like. But aside from optimization as you get better, you will typically always use all 3 primals eventually, and the power difference between them in an opener sense is actually small enough that the DPS loss in a burst from quote-unquote choosing wrong is relatively small. Warrior has a similar effect, as both Infuriate and in a release lights up the big shiny buttons to use. Paladin, for example, also has a mild case of click the shiny button with Requiescat, but it isn't quite as pronounced as for Warrior and Summoner. The second factor that can cause a job to be very easy is an extremely flexible rotation. This commonly crops up from rotations that don't keep up damage buffs, and mainly use their basic combos as a filler when waiting for other, better buttons to be available. Especially for jobs where their burst does not heavily rely on a tight amount of resources generated by this filler combo. For example, technically Gunbreaker has such a filler combo, but as they are on a very tight budget due to how costly their bursts are, combined with the strictness of the timing of Gnashing Fang, this makes Gunbreaker not qualify for this factor. On the other hand, both Paladin and Dark Knight have a lot of flexibility in their rotations. Dark Knight because, while they rely on their MP to keep their damage buff, and for bursts, they tend to generate plenty of MP to keep their damage buff rolling, and typically their burst will use however much MP you happen to have. Meaning, if you don't have much, it doesn't break anything. For Paladin, while their combo is necessary to prepare the best combos for the filler section of their burst, the flexibility of the filler combos themselves lend the Paladin the freedom to generally get really good fillers without too much effort. Both Red Mage and Dancer are also great examples of DPS with very flexible filler rotations, which greatly alleviate the pressure both of these jobs can often feel from the unpredictable and random parts of their rotations. Summoner is, of course, also a great example of this, as you can very freely choose which order to use your primals in if you need it, and if something requires it, you can even speedrun through the primals and just use the best parts of them, allowing the Summoner to catch up their rotations if they fall behind, where a lot of other jobs, like Gunbreaker, simply might not be able to do that without a huge cost. The third factor that can cause a job to be very easy is a severe lack of oGCDs. I have a short on this if you're confused. The masters of not a lot of oGCDs are Warrior and Reaper, with Warrior's offensive toolkit having something in the ballpark of 6 oGCDs per minute, which contrasts well with Gunbreaker, who reaches that number with their Gnashing Fang combo alone. For Reaper, it isn't quite as severe, as its enshroud windows tend to speed it up a bit, with faster GCDs and some extra oGCDs. However, as Reaper also has a very flexible rotation, with surprisingly few buttons that have to be used precisely on cooldown, this further highlights the mellowness of the job outside of bursts. Paladin is also a great example of this factor, with only 8 offensive oGCDs per minute. Healers also tend to score high on this factor, as presumably they would have very limited amounts of offensive oGCDs. However, only Sage and White Mage really score on this, with White Mage having As-Eyes and Presence of Mind, and Sage who genuinely has 0. Meanwhile, Scholar's Energy Drain Spam bursts and Astrologian's Super Dumping card bursts very handily removes them from this factor entirely. The fourth factor that can cause a job to be very easy is a lack of damage buffs to worry about. Whether this is a raid-wide that optimally you want to plan with the rest of the buffs, or a personal buff so you need to pack all of your big damage buttons in the time where you do the most damage, the lack of these can cause a job to be a lot easier to pick up. Once you start to aim to optimize and perfect a job, this factor can become somewhat irrelevant, as jobs that don't have personal damage buffs still can align themselves with everyone else's damage buffs. But now you need to keep track of it separately, instead of being able to just clock your damage buff with the rest of them. Possibly the best example of this factor is Warrior. You technically have a burst cooldown to align with buffs if you so desire, but it does not boost the damage of any other buttons than the ones it enables in the first place. Not only that, but inner release itself helps you fill out 4 of the common 6 GCDs expected of a raid buff burst window. Other good examples of this factor are Samurai and Machinist. However, due to both of the jobs' sheer capacity to burst in a raid buff window, this can be misleading, as while this factor makes the jobs incredibly easy to pick up, it makes the uphill climb of mastering the jobs absolutely brutal, since you have to set your clock to match with everyone else's raid buffs instead. Sage is the only healer with no timed damage buff of some sort, meaning that the only thing it has to plan around is Flemmer, and due to its utility of also being instant for mobility, it isn't unreasonable to sometimes find that you have no Flemmers to plan for bursts in the first place. The fifth factor that can cause a job to be very easy is simply a very intuitive rotation. Can you figure out what the job wants to do quite easily, and is the intuitive rotation relatively close to what is considered optimal? The Fantastic Four of Warrior, Summoner, Dancer and Reaper all have very intuitive rotations in this regard, and while they each have some points of confusion, the general idea of the rotations are, at a basic level, extremely intuitive. Warrior wants to set up their damage buff and then face plant on all of their damage buttons. Reaper wants to set up Death's Design and get their raid buff up quickly so that they can get into Shroud quickly. Summoner really wants to summon Bahamut, and then the confusion is what to summon next. And then Dancer, of course, wants to use its standard finish and technical finish, with the massive confusion being the question of, should I use Devilment before or after technical finish? The answer's after, for the record. It is always after technical finish. Another excellent example of an intuitive rotation is Paladin. In fact, Paladin is also one of the jobs that gains the least value out of whatever preparation they can do leading up to a burst, which of course means that this whole thing with preparing Royal Authority before you use Fight or Flight mainly stems from the raid buff alignment. Intuitive rotations both help with the ease of learning a job, but simultaneously also greatly help with mastering the jobs, as long as the optimal rotation doesn't lose the intuitive part. I should also mention that, of course, a job being intuitive is an extremely subjective thing, so when I say these jobs are very intuitive, it relates more to the fact that a lot more players find them intuitive. You might not, of course. The sixth factor that can cause a job to be very easy, somewhat in extension of the fifth factor, are jobs with obvious or otherwise trivial burst rotations. Warrior uses Primal Rend, Fellcleave 3 times, and then any inner chaos you have. Of course you would do that. Summoner summons Bahamut, because of course you do. Reaper enters Enshroud, although the double Enshroud sort of confuses this one a bit. But the general idea here are jobs that have 1, 2 or 3 buttons that sort of naturally fills out most of the raid buff window, or otherwise somewhat trivially can fit all of their big buttons within this special 15-second window. Naturally, to pick up a job, you don't need to use raid buff windows perfectly. You don't even need to do that to be good at a job. Placing your bursts consistently, perfectly within raid buffs is more a master aspect for harder jobs. For easier jobs, it can become a thing to focus on, simply because of how easy it is to learn to do in the first place. The less oGCDs an opener or burst has also has a huge impact on this factor, which is also why both Warrior and Paladin fit this one really well. And the seventh and final factor that can cause a job to be very easy is of course that you can also just ignore all of the optimization and just randomly mash your buttons and see what happens. That way, all jobs become very easy to play. Just avoid learning anything, and everything automatically is trivial. Genius. Anyway, all jokes aside, what makes a job easy can of course vary heavily from player to player. Some find the easiest jobs in the game to be brutal because of one specific little thing, or they find them impossible because they're too boring. Some simply love the excitement of the harder and more complex jobs. Other players find tanks or healers, regardless of how easy they are to play offensively, to be impossibly difficult to play because of either genuine difficulty or fear of the role. Healer anxiety and tank anxiety are very real after all. This is also the reason why I did not use healers very much as examples, as the difficulty of these jobs can vary greatly based on how much healing your groups require, and aside from White Mage with its relatively straightforward healing toolkit, all three of the other healers each have their own oddities in regards to how they go about healing. Anyway, with that all said, once again, I would love to hear what makes a job easy to play for you, so do tell me about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can make sure to let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, both Summoner and Paladin, both considered very easy jobs to play nowadays, used to be some of the hardest jobs to play well before each of their reworks. Paladin had an incredibly unintuitive rotation where you intentionally let resources go to waste, and the rotation had no flexibility at all. Summoners had several ways to significantly hamper their damage output through small mistakes, which affected the summoner's rotation for over a minute for a single mistake.